The sound of sirens cutting through the morning mist over Blackwood Lake still haunts me. 3 police cars, their red and blue lights reflecting off the water like broken glass. All because a woman named Margaret Thornfield decided I didn't belong in my own family's cabin. She stood there on my dock, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at me like I was some common criminal. Her voice sharp enough to cut steel. "Officer, this man is trespassing on private property. I want him arrested immediately." What Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the property deed in my back pocket didn't just cover the small cabin where I'd been quietly rebuilding my life. It covered every single lot, every road, every inch of what they called Blackwood Heights, the most exclusive gated community in 3 counties. I'm Thomas Blackwood, and this is the story of how I went from being the community's most hated resident to owning the very ground beneath their feet. But more than that, it's the story of how a woman's cruelty led to the most satisfying revenge I've ever witnessed, and I didn't even have to lift a finger to make it happen. Let me take you back to where this all began, 6 months before that morning on the dock. I had just buried my father, William Blackwood, after a long battle with cancer. The funeral was small, just me, a handful of his old business associates, and Father Miguel from St. Catherine's. My father had been a quiet man, a private man, who built his wealth slowly and carefully over 40 years in real estate development. The cabin on Blackwood Lake had been our family's retreat since I was 7 years old. Every summer, Dad and I would drive up from the city, just the 2 of us after Mom passed when I was 12. We'd fish at dawn, read books on the porch in the afternoon, and talk about everything and nothing as the sun set over the water. Those were the happiest memories of my childhood. After Dad's death, I found myself drawn back to that cabin like a magnet. My life in the city had fallen apart. My marriage had ended badly 2 years prior. My business consulting firm had struggled through the pandemic, and I was frankly tired of the noise, the traffic, and the endless chase for more money that never seemed to bring any peace. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it the previous summer. A modest 2-bedroom log structure with a wraparound porch and a small dock that jutted into the lake. It wasn't fancy. The kitchen appliances were from the 1990s. The furniture was comfortable but worn, and the heating system made sounds like it was trying to communicate with aliens. But it was home. I decided to stay, not just for a weekend or a month, but indefinitely. I set up a home office in the spare bedroom, transferred my remaining clients to remote consultations, and began the process of truly healing from everything I'd lost. That's when I first encountered Margaret Thornfield. She appeared at my door on a Tuesday morning in early spring, dressed like she was attending a board meeting at some Fortune 500 company. Navy blue blazer, pearl necklace, shoes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her silver hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. "Excuse me," she said, not waiting for me to invite her in. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Blackwood Heights Homeowners Association. I understand you've been residing in the cabin." I leaned against the doorframe, coffee mug in hand. "That's right, Thomas Blackwood." "Nice to meet you." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Blackwood? Any relation to the original family that owned this land?" "William Blackwood was my father." "I see." She pulled out a leather folder and extracted several sheets of paper. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I'm here to inform you that permanent residence in recreational structures is strictly prohibited under our community covenants. This cabin was designated for weekend and seasonal use only." I set my coffee down carefully. "I'm sorry, but what community covenants? This is my family's property." "Your family sold this land to Blackwood Heights Development Corporation in 1987, she said, waving the papers at me. "These properties are all governed by HOA regulations. I'm afraid you'll need to limit your stays to no more than 14 days per month, and you cannot use this as a primary residence. The thing is, I knew she was wrong. Dad had sold most of his land holdings to various development companies over the years, but he'd always kept the original cabin plot. I had the deed somewhere in his papers. But something about Margaret's aggressive tone made me want to handle this carefully. "I'll need to review my father's documents," I said. "Can you give me a few days?" Her smile was razor thin. "Of course. But understand, Mr. Blackwood, that if you're not in compliance by Friday, we'll be forced to take legal action. The integrity of our community depends on everyone following the rules." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and you might want to do something about that dock. It's looking quite shabby, and it's bringing down property values for the rest of us." As I watched her walk away, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something about Margaret Thornfield that reminded me of every schoolyard bully, every corporate tyrant, every person who had ever used a small amount of power to make someone else's life miserable. I spent that afternoon going through Dad's filing cabinets and safe, looking for the property deed. What I found instead were dozens of folders labeled with various company names, legal documents I didn't understand, and correspondence dating back decades. The deed had to be there somewhere, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Meanwhile, Margaret wasted no time making her presence known. Over the next few days, I received 2 more visits from her once to complain about my inappropriate fishing attire, jeans, and a t-shirt, and once to inform me that my pickup truck didn't meet the community's vehicle standards and would need to be parked behind the cabin where it couldn't be seen from the road. I started to understand why the lake had felt so peaceful during all those childhood summers. We'd always come during the week, when most of the other property owners weren't around. The weekends, it turned out, were when Blackwood Heights transformed into something entirely different. The community had grown since my childhood. What had once been a few scattered cabins around the lake was now a sprawling development of massive homes, perfectly manicured lawns, and residents who seemed to have nothing better to do than police each other's compliance with an ever-growing list of rules. Margaret, it turned out, was the queen of this particular castle. On Thursday evening, she returned with reinforcements, a tall, thin man named Howard and a shorter woman with suspicious eyes named Patricia. They stood on my porch like a tribunal, all holding clipboards. "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret began, "we've completed our inspection of your property, and I'm afraid we found numerous violations." Howard cleared his throat and began reading from his list. "Improper outdoor furniture storage, non-compliant dock maintenance, unauthorized vehicle parking, and," he paused dramatically, "hanging laundry on an external line, which is strictly prohibited under Section 12 of our community standards." I looked over at the small clothesline I'd strung between 2 trees. 2 shirts and a pair of jeans fluttered in the evening breeze. "You're kidding me?" "We take our community standards very seriously," Patricia chimed in. "Property values depend on maintaining a certain aesthetic." "And," Margaret added, pulling out another sheet of paper, "we've confirmed that this structure is not zoned for permanent residence. You have until tomorrow evening to vacate, or will be forced to contact local authorities." I felt my temper rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident that my family owns this property outright. I just need a little more time to locate the paperwork." "Time is up," she said flatly. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Blackwood. No exceptions." As they walked away, I heard Patricia mutter to Howard, "Some people think they're above the community standards." That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of my father's whiskey and watched the stars reflect in the dark water. Part of me wondered if it would be easier to just leave. Find an apartment somewhere, start over again. But every time I considered it, I thought about all those summers with Dad, all those conversations about integrity and standing up for what's right. "Son," he used to say, There are people in this world who use rules like weapons. They find the smallest amount of power and use it to make others feel small. The only way to deal with a bully is to stand your ground. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going anywhere. But I had no idea what Margaret Thornfield was capable of, or how far she was willing to go to get her way. Friday came and went without any sign of Margaret or her enforcement committee. I spent the day organizing Dad's papers and making phone calls to local government offices, trying to understand the property ownership history. The county clerk's office was helpful but slow. They promised to pull all the relevant documents and have them ready for me by the following week. I should have known that Margaret's silence didn't mean she had given up. Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine rumbling outside my cabin. Through the bedroom window, I could see a large truck with Blackwood Heights, maintenance painted on the side. 3 men in orange safety vests were unloading equipment. I threw on some clothes and hurried outside. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" The crew chief, a burly man with graying hair, looked up from his clipboard. "Morning. We're here to remove the non-compliant dock structure." "What? You can't just tear down my dock." He shrugged apologetically. "Sorry, buddy. We just follow orders. Got a work order here, signed by Margaret Thornfield, HOA president. Says the structure's in violation and needs to be removed immediately." I felt my heart rate spike. That dock wasn't just some random structure, it was where Dad and I had spent countless mornings fishing, where he'd taught me to tie knots and read the weather patterns on the water. It was practically sacred ground. "Hold on," I said, pulling out my phone. "I need to make some calls." "Look, I understand you're upset," the crew chief said, "but we're just doing our job. If you've got a problem with the order, you need to take it up with the HOA." While I was frantically trying to reach anyone who could stop this, the crew began dismantling my dock. Each board they pulled up felt like they were tearing apart my childhood memories. The sound of crowbars and power tools echoed across the lake, and I could see other residents coming out on their porches to watch the show. By noon, my dock was gone. Nothing left but bare pilings sticking up out of the water like broken teeth. I was still standing at the water's edge, staring at the destruction, when Margaret appeared beside me. She had somehow approached without me noticing, like a predator stalking prey. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Mr. Blackwood," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But rules are rules." The dock was clearly not up to community standards. I turned to face her, and I could feel the anger burning in my chest. That dock was built by my father 30 years ago. It was perfectly safe and functional. "It was an eyesore," she replied coolly. "And since you've chosen to remain on the property despite clear violations, we had no choice but to begin enforcement actions." "What's next?" I asked. "Are you going to tear down the cabin too?" Her smile was cold and calculating. "That depends entirely on your willingness to comply with community standards, doesn't it?" As she walked away, I noticed that she wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of my property line were Howard and Patricia, along with 2 other people I didn't recognize. They were watching me like vultures, waiting for something to die. The harassment began in earnest after that. On Sunday, I received a citation for improper lawn maintenance because I hadn't mowed the small patch of grass behind my cabin. Never mind that it was still early spring and the grass was barely 2 inches tall. On Monday, Margaret appeared with a measuring tape and cited me for having my garbage cans visible from the road. The cans were beside my cabin, exactly where they'd always been, but apparently the community standards required them to be completely hidden from view. On Tuesday, I got a formal letter demanding that I paint my cabin because the weathered wood aesthetic was not in compliance with approved exterior finishes. The cabin had looked the same for 30 years, but suddenly it was a problem. Each citation came with a fine ranging from $50 to $200, and each letter warned that continued non-compliance would result in legal action. I was hemorrhaging money and patience, but I refused to back down. The psychological pressure was intense. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. Margaret's followers, and that's really what they were, seemed to take turns walking past my property, taking pictures, making notes on clipboards. They'd gather in small groups at the community's main dock and point in my direction while having hushed conversations. But the breaking point came on a Thursday evening in mid-April. I had just settled down with a book when I heard voices outside. Through the window, I could see flashlight beams moving around my property. 4 people were conducting some kind of inspection in the dark. Margaret, Howard, Patricia, and someone I didn't recognize with an official-looking badge. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" Margaret stepped forward, her face stern in the flashlight beam. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Inspector Davies from the County Health Department. We've filed a complaint regarding possible septic system violations." Inspector Davies, a tired-looking man in his 50s, held up his credentials. "Sir, I need to inspect your septic system. We've received reports of potential environmental hazards." "What kind of hazards?" I asked, though I already knew this was bogus. Dad had the septic system updated just 5 years ago, and I had all the inspection certificates. "Possible groundwater contamination," Margaret said smoothly. "Given the age of your system and the proximity to the lake, we're concerned about environmental impact." The inspection took 2 hours. Davies was professional but thorough, checking every pipe, every connection, every aspect of the septic system. He took water samples from 3 different locations around my property. Margaret and her committee watched every move, clearly hoping he'd find something, anything, they could use against me. In the end, Davies found nothing wrong. The system was functioning perfectly and posed no environmental risk. But the damage was done. I now had a county health department file with my name on it, and Margaret had demonstrated that she was willing to involve government agencies in her campaign to drive me out. After they left, I sat on my porch steps and tried to process what was happening to me. This wasn't just about HOA rules or property standards. This was personal. Margaret Thornfield had decided that I didn't belong in her perfect community, and she was going to use every tool at her disposal to force me out. I thought about Dad, about all those conversations we'd had about standing up to bullies. But I also thought about the cost, financial and emotional, of continuing this fight. My savings were being drained by legal fees and HOA fines. My sleep was being disrupted by constant stress and surveillance. My peaceful retreat had become a battlefield. The next morning brought a new escalation that I never saw coming. I woke up to the sound of vehicles in my driveway, multiple vehicles. Through the window, I could see 2 police cars, a white van from the County Code Enforcement Office, and Margaret's black BMW. There had to be 8 or 9 people standing in my front yard. I threw on clothes and stepped outside, my heart pounding. One of the police officers, a young man with a serious expression, approached me with a clipboard. "Mr. Thomas Blackwood?" "Yes, that's me." "Sir, I have a court order here requiring you to vacate this property within 72 hours pending resolution of a property ownership dispute." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "I'm sorry. What?" Margaret stepped forward, her face a mask of fake concern. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm truly sorry it's come to this. But when someone refuses to cooperate with legal community standards, we have no choice but to pursue all available remedies." I took the papers from the officer with trembling hands. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the basic message was clear. Margaret and the HOA had filed a lawsuit claiming that my occupancy of the cabin violated community covenants and local zoning laws. Until the matter was resolved in court, I was prohibited from living on the property. "This is insane," I said, looking up at the circle of faces surrounding me. "This is my family's property. I have every right to be here." "Then you should have no trouble proving that in court," Margaret replied smoothly. "Until then, however, you'll need to find alternative accommodations." The code enforcement officer, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry about this situation. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings. The property will then be secured until the court hearing." As I stood there, holding those papers, watching Margaret's satisfied expression, I felt something crack inside me. Not break, crack. Like ice under pressure, still holding together, but fundamentally changed. "You have no idea what you've just started," I said quietly. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "Excuse me?" "Nothing," I said, turning toward my cabin. "I need to pack." But as I walked away from that group of officials and HOA enforcers, I wasn't thinking about packing. I was thinking about the boxes of my father's papers in the back bedroom and the nagging feeling that I'd missed something important. Something that was about to change everything. I spent the next 3 days in a cheap motel 20 miles from the lake, surrounded by cardboard boxes and manila folders. Every surface in the cramped room was covered with my father's business documents, contracts, correspondence, financial records dating back 40 years. I was looking for one thing, the property deed that would prove my right to live in the cabin. What I found instead was something far more interesting. It started with a folder labeled BHD Core 1987-1992. Inside were dozens of letters between my father and various officials at Blackwood Heights Development Corporation. The correspondence painted a picture I had never known existed. In 1987, my father hadn't just sold some land to a development company. He had created Blackwood Heights Development Corporation. He was the sole owner and primary investor in the entire project. The letters told a fascinating story. Dad had owned nearly 2,000 acres around the lakeland that had been in our family since the 1920s. Instead of selling it all to outside developers, he had formed his own company to carefully manage the development of what would become Blackwood Heights. He wanted to preserve the natural beauty of the area while creating a sustainable community that would benefit from property appreciation. But there was more. In a folder marked Legal Ongoing, I found correspondence with lawyers dating from 1992 to 2010. Apparently, there had been a long-running dispute between my father and the HOA board that was established to manage the day-to-day operations of the community. The HOA had gradually expanded its authority beyond what my father had originally intended, and he had been quietly fighting their overreach for nearly 20 years. The final piece of the puzzle was in a sealed envelope marked Thomas Open only after my death. Inside was a letter in my father's careful handwriting, along with several legal documents I didn't immediately recognize. "Son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've probably discovered that Blackwood Heights is more complicated than it appears. I spent the last 20 years of my life fighting to protect what we built there, but I was never able to completely resolve the legal issues. That task now falls to you." The letter explained that my father had structured the original development corporation in a specific way to maintain ultimate control over the community. While the HOA managed day-to-day operations, major decisions about property use, community standards, and development required approval from the corporation's board of directors. And according to the documents in the envelope, I was now the sole member of that board. But the real bombshell was in the last paragraph of the letter. The original Development Corporation charter includes a provision that allows the board to dissolve the HOA and assume direct management of the community if the HOA exceeds its authority or fails to act in the best interests of A, property owners. I never used this provision because I hoped the situation would improve. But if Margaret Thornfield and her followers continue their campaign of harassment and overreach, you now have the legal authority to stop them permanently. I sat in that motel room until nearly midnight, reading through every document, cross-referencing dates and signatures, trying to understand the full scope of what my father had left me. It was like discovering a hidden weapon in an attic, something powerful and dangerous that had been waiting for the right moment to be used. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and spent 6 hours with a real estate attorney named Linda Chin. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in property law and corporate litigation. I spread my father's documents across her conference table and told her the whole story. "This is extraordinary," she said after reviewing everything. "Your father essentially created a legal time bomb. The HOA has been operating under the assumption that they have ultimate authority over community standards, but according to these documents, they're actually just a management company operating under the supervision of your development corporation. So I can stop them from harassing me?" "You can do much more than that," Linda said, leaning back in her chair. "If we can prove that the HOA has exceeded their authority, which based on your story, they clearly have the legal right to dissolve their board and take direct control of the entire community." The legal terminology was complex, but the basic concept was simple. My father had created a fail-safe mechanism to prevent exactly the kind of abuse of power that Margaret Thornfield was now wielding. The HOA was supposed to maintain property values and provide basic services. They were not supposed to harass individual property owners or make arbitrary decisions about who could and couldn't live in the community. "What's our next step?" I asked. Linda smiled. "First, we file a response to their eviction lawsuit. Then we file our own lawsuit, claiming breach of fiduciary duty and exceeding corporate authority. And then," she paused dramatically, "we serve Margaret Thornfield with notice that her reign as HOA president is about to come to a very sudden end." That afternoon, I got a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Blackwood?" The voice was elderly, female, and slightly shaky. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I live at 247 Lakeshore Drive in Blackwood Heights. I heard about your troubles with the HOA, and I think we need to talk." Eleanor turned out to be an 83-year-old retired teacher who had lived in the community for 15 years. She invited me to meet her at a coffee shop in town, away from the prying eyes of Margaret's surveillance network. She was a small woman with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. We sat in a corner booth, and she spoke in hushed tones, like we were planning some kind of covert operation. "I want you to know," she began, "that not everyone in the community supports what Margaret is doing to you. There are quite a few of us who are disgusted by her behavior. Why hasn't anyone spoken up?" Eleanor sighed. "Because Margaret Thornfield rules that HOA board with an iron fist. She's made it clear that anyone who opposes her will become her next target. People are afraid." She told me about other residents who had been harassed by Margaret's enforcement committee. An elderly man who was cited for having bird feeders that attracted nuisance wildlife. A young couple who were fined repeatedly for their children's toys being visible from the street. A military veteran who was forced to remove an American flag from his front porch because it didn't meet the HOA's flag display standards. "But the worst part," Eleanor continued, "is how she treats people who don't fit her vision of the perfect community. Last year, she drove out a single mother who was struggling financially. The year before, it was a retired teacher who couldn't afford to upgrade his cabin to Margaret's standards." I felt a chill of recognition. "She's been doing this to other people?" "For years," Eleanor confirmed. "You're just the latest in a long line of people she's decided don't belong here." "But, Thomas," she leaned forward and lowered her voice even further, "you might be the first person who actually has the power to stop her." Eleanor had done her own research into the community's history. She knew about my father's role in developing Blackwood Heights, and she suspected there was more to the legal structure than most residents realized. "Your father was a good man," she said. "He used to walk around the lake every evening, talking to residents, listening to their concerns. He cared about this place and the people who lived here. Margaret Thornfield cares only about power and control." As we talked, Eleanor revealed something that made my blood run cold. Margaret hadn't just filed the eviction lawsuit against me, she was also secretly working with a commercial development company that wanted to buy several properties around the lake and turn them into a luxury resort. "She's been pushing out long-term residents," Eleanor explained, "and encouraging them to sell to this development company. She gets a finder's fee for every property they acquire. Your cabin, with its prime location and direct lake access, would be worth a fortune to them." Suddenly, Margaret's campaign against me made perfect sense. This wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about money. She wanted to force me to sell so she could collect a commission and help her developer friends acquire the best property on the lake. But what Margaret didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with the one person who actually owned the entire community she was trying to control. I left that coffee shop with Eleanor's phone number and a promise that she would help me contact other residents who had been victimized by Margaret's abuse of power. But more importantly, I left with a clear understanding of what needed to be done. Margaret Thornfield had spent years using fear and intimidation to control people who had no recourse against her authority. She had gotten away with it because no one had the legal standing to challenge her. That was about to change. The court hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late April. Judge Patricia Brennan presided over a modest courtroom in the county courthouse, with windows that looked out over rolling hills that reminded me of the view from my cabin porch. Margaret arrived with two lawyers, expensive-looking men in tailored suits, who carried themselves like they'd never lost a case. She wore a dark blue dress that looked like armor, and her expression was confident, almost smug. She clearly expected this to be a routine victory. I sat at the defendant's table with Linda Chen, surrounded by boxes of my father's documents. Linda had spent the previous week preparing what she called the nuclear option, a comprehensive legal response that would not only defend my right to live in the cabin, but also expose the entire pattern of HOA overreach that Margaret had been orchestrating for years. But first, we had to sit through Margaret's presentation. Her lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Richardson, presented their case with theatrical precision. He talked about community standards, property values, and the importance of consistent rule enforcement. He painted me as a selfish individual who thought he was above the law, someone who was damaging the peaceful community that the HOA worked so hard to maintain. "Your Honor," Richardson concluded, "Mr. Blackwood has repeatedly violated clearly established community covenants. He has refused to comply with reasonable requests for property maintenance, and his continued illegal occupancy of a recreational structure threatens the integrity of the entire Blackwood Heights community. We respectfully request that the court uphold the eviction order and require Mr. Blackwood to vacate the property immediately." Margaret took the witness stand and testified about my various violations with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every word. She spoke about community standards and property values, about the importance of consistent rule enforcement, about how my presence was disrupting the peaceful nature of their neighborhood. Under cross-examination, Linda began to chip away at Margaret's testimony. "Mrs. Thornfield, how long have you served as president of the Blackwood Heights HOA?" 7 years. "And during that time, how many residents have you initiated legal action against?" Margaret's composure slipped slightly. "I don't keep exact records. Would you say it's more than 10? Possibly. More than 20? I would need to review my files." Linda pulled out a thick folder. "Your Honor, I have here documentation of 37 separate legal actions initiated by Mrs. Thornfield's HOA board against community residents over the past 7 years. That's an average of more than 5 lawsuits per year against people who live in a community of only 68 homes. Judge Brennan looked up from her notes. That does seem excessive, counselor. But Linda was just getting started. She called Eleanor Hartwell as a witness, and the elderly woman testified about the pattern of harassment she had observed. She spoke about the single mother, the military veteran, the elderly man with the bird feeders, all people who had been targeted by Margaret's enforcement actions. In your opinion, Mrs. Hartwell, do these enforcement actions appear to be targeting specific types of residents? Objection, Richardson called out. Calls for speculation. I'll allow it, Judge Brennan said. Eleanor looked directly at Margaret as she answered. Yes. Mrs. Thornfield consistently targets people who are elderly, financially struggling, or who don't fit her vision of what the community should look like. She uses the HOA rules like a weapon to drive out people she doesn't want as neighbors. The courtroom was dead silent. Margaret's face had gone pale, and her lawyers were frantically writing notes. But the real bombshell came when Linda called me to the witness stand. Mr. Blackwood, can you tell the court about your family's relationship to Blackwood Heights? I took a deep breath and looked out at the packed courtroom. Word had somehow gotten out about the hearing, and I could see residents from the community scattered throughout the gallery. Some looked curious, others appeared worried, and a few seemed downright hostile. Your Honor, my father, William Blackwood, didn't just own property at Blackwood Heights. He created Blackwood Heights. He was the sole owner and founder of Blackwood Heights Development Corporation, which developed and continues to own the entire community. The murmur that went through the courtroom sounded like a wave breaking on shore. Margaret's eyes went wide, and her lawyers started whispering frantically among themselves. And what is your current relationship to Blackwood Heights Development Corporation? As my father's sole heir, I am now the president and only board member of the corporation. Linda approached the bench and handed Judge Brennan a thick folder. Your Honor, these are the original incorporation documents, property deeds, and development agreements that establish Mr. Blackwood's legal authority over the entire Blackwood Heights community. Judge Brennan took several minutes to review the documents, and the courtroom remained silent except for the sound of papers rustling. Finally, she looked up. Mrs. Thornfield, were you aware of these corporate relationships when you filed your eviction lawsuit? Margaret looked like she might be sick. No, Your Honor. I was not aware. Mr. Richardson, did your clients inform you of the corporate structure of the community when they retained your services? The lawyer looked uncomfortable. No, Your Honor. We were led to believe this was a straightforward HOA enforcement matter. Linda stood up. Your Honor, we move to dismiss the eviction lawsuit as frivolous and without merit. Furthermore, we are prepared to file our own lawsuit against the HOA board for exceeding their corporate authority and violating their fiduciary duty to the community. But Judge Brennan held up her hand. Before we get to that, I want to understand the scope of Mr. Blackwood's authority. According to these documents, what powers does the Development Corporation have over the HOA? Linda smiled. Complete supervisory authority, Your Honor. The HOA exists at the pleasure of the Development Corporation. If the HOA exceeds its authority or fails to act in the best interests of the community, the corporation has the right to dissolve the HOA board and assume direct management of all community affairs. The courtroom erupted. Residents were talking among themselves. Margaret was in heated conversation with her lawyers, and I could see several people pulling out their phones to make calls. Judge Brennan banged her gavel for order. Given the complexity of the corporate relationships involved, I am dismissing the eviction lawsuit against Mr. Blackwood. Furthermore, I am ordering all parties to participate in mediation to resolve the broader governance issues within the Blackwood Heights community. As we left the courthouse, I could see groups of residents gathered in the parking lot, having intense discussions. Some approached me with apologies and expressions of support. Others hurried away, probably to call Margaret and find out what this meant for their property values.